Caleb wrapped the sandwich in a napkin with shaking hands. It was madness. Complete madness. His 3-year-old daughter Alara hadn't eaten since yesterday's breakfast, and here he was, about to give away the only meal standing between her and going to bed hungry again. But this elderly woman huddled in the alley kept staring at the sandwich in his hands, her frail body trembling against the brick wall, and he couldn't walk past her suffering. Not when he knew exactly what that kind of desperation looked like in a child's eyes. So he gave it to her. All of it. She whispered her thanks through chattering teeth and disappeared into the shadows. And Caleb. He started the long walk home to his tiny apartment, wondering how he'd explain to Alara why there'd be nothing for dinner again. 6 hours later, someone came to his door. When Caleb peered through the peephole, his blood ran cold. 5 black SUVs lined his narrow street like something out of a movie. Men and women in expensive suits were stepping out into the rain. And walking toward his building, dressed like she owned half the city, was her, the elderly woman from the alley. Only now she looked like someone who could buy and sell his entire neighborhood without thinking twice. "Mr. Caleb," she said when he cracked open the door. "We need to talk." What happened next? Caleb's life, and little Alara's future, was never going to be the same. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Caleb hadn't eaten since the day before yesterday. His stomach had given up growling hours ago. Now it just felt hollow, the same way everything else did since the factory accident destroyed his back and his livelihood. He sat on the edge of his mattress in the cramped studio apartment, watching Alara sleep on the only real bed he could afford. The job interview had been a disaster. Another "will call you." That really meant, don't hold your breath. He'd walked through the rain-soaked streets of Jersey City, replaying every moment. The way the manager's eyes had lingered on the slight limp in his left leg. The questions about his injury. The polite smile that never reached her eyes. The sandwich in his jacket pocket had been meant for two, half for him, half for Alara when she woke up. It was all they had until his next unemployment check, and that was still 3 days away. The shortcut through the alley had seemed like a good idea until he saw her. She was pressed against the brick wall like she was trying to disappear into it. This elderly woman in a tattered black coat. Her silver hair hung in wet strands around a face that looked like it had seen too much hardship. Her hands, God, her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold herself upright. "Please," she whispered when she noticed him staring. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." Caleb looked at the sandwich wrapped in its thin napkin. Then he looked at this woman who reminded him of what he might become, what Alara might become if he kept failing her. He held out the sandwich. The woman stared at it like it was a miracle. "I can't. That might be all you have." "My daughter's sleeping," Caleb said softly, even though it was a lie. Even though Alara would wake up hungry and he'd have nothing to give her. "She won't miss it." Caleb's fingers traced the edges of the photograph, worn soft from years of handling. In the picture, he stood beside a massive industrial conveyor belt, his hard hat tilted at a confident angle, safety vest stretched across broad shoulders that knew their own strength. His smile was different than easy, unguarded. The smile of a man who believed hard work and determination were enough to build a future. That was Maryland. That was before. The photo had been taken 3 years ago at the steel processing plant where he'd worked his way up from floor sweeper to manufacturing supervisor. 32 years old and finally making enough money to talk about marriage, about buying a house, about giving Alara the kind of childhood he'd never had. Sarah had taken the picture during the company picnic, her laugh floating over the sound of machinery even on a Saturday. Now Sarah was gone, taken by a drunk driver on her way home from the grocery store. The plant had closed 6 months after his injury, budget cuts, they'd said, nothing personal. And Caleb was here, in a studio apartment in Jersey City that smelled like mold and broken dreams, trying to stretch $17 until his next unemployment check arrived. He slipped the photograph back into his wallet, next to Alara's school picture and the business card from today's failed interview. His back throbbed as he stood up, that familiar electric pain shooting down his left leg. The doctors had said he was lucky. The falling beam could have killed him instead of just crushing 3 vertebrae and ending his career in anything requiring heavy lifting. Lucky, right? The interview had lasted exactly 12 minutes. Caleb had watched the hiring manager's enthusiasm drain from her face the moment he mentioned the limitations from his injury. "We'll be in touch," she'd said, already reaching for the next resume in her stack. Alara stirred on the bed. Her small body curled around the stuffed elephant that had belonged to Sarah. At 3 years old, she was all Caleb had left that mattered. Her trust, her love, the way she still believed her daddy could fix anything. It was the only thing keeping him from simply giving up. Rain pelted the single window as Caleb pulled on his jacket. The sandwich in his pocket felt heavier than it should have. White bread, a thin slice of bologna, the last of the mustard. He'd planned to split it with Alara when she woke up from her nap. Half for her, half for him, washed down with the remainder of the milk carton. It would have to be enough. It always had to be enough. The streets of Jersey City blurred past as Caleb made his way home, each step sending a jolt through his damaged spine. He should have taken the main road, but the shortcut through the industrial district would save him 10 minutes and spare his back the extra distance. Besides, the alley was usually empty this time of evening. The rain had turned the narrow passage between warehouses into a canyon of wet brick and shadows. A single streetlight cast sickly yellow illumination that seemed to make the darkness deeper rather than pushing it away. Steam rose from the asphalt, carrying the scent of garbage and desperation that seemed to define his entire life now. That's when he saw her. She was pressed against the brick wall like she was trying to become part of it. This elderly woman in a tattered black coat that had seen better decades. Her silver hair hung in wet strands around a face that looked carved from years of hardship. But it was her hands that stopped Caleb in his tracks. They were shaking so violently she could barely hold herself upright. She looked up as his footsteps echoed in the alley, and Caleb saw something in her eyes that he recognized. The hollow stare of someone who had fallen through all the cracks society pretended didn't exist. The look of a person who had counted their last dollars so many times the numbers had lost all meaning. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." Caleb's hand moved automatically to the sandwich in his pocket. The bread would be getting soggy from the humidity, but it was still food, still sustenance, still the only thing standing between Alara and another night of going to bed hungry. He looked at this woman, really looked at her. The way her coat hung loose around a frame that had clearly lost too much weight too quickly. The careful way she held herself, as if any sudden movement might shatter what little dignity she had left. She reminded him of what he saw in his own mirror on the worst days, when the pretense of having everything under control finally cracked. "My daughter," he started to say, then stopped. What was he going to tell this woman? That a 3-year-old's hunger was more important than hers? That Alara's need somehow outweighed the desperation written across the stranger's face? Caleb pulled out the sandwich, its napkin wrapping slightly damp from the rain. The woman stared at it like it was a miracle wrapped in white bread and bologna. "I can't," she said, even as her eyes never left the food. "That might be all you have." "My daughter's sleeping," Caleb said softly, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. "She won't miss it." He held the sandwich out, and when the woman's trembling fingers closed around it, he felt something shift in his chest. Not regret, something else. Something that felt almost like relief. "She needs it more," he added, and realized he meant it. The woman's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the rain. "Thank you," she whispered. I can't tell you what this means." Caleb nodded and turned away before he could change his mind. As he walked deeper into the alley, he heard the soft rustle of paper behind him and knew she was unwrapping the sandwich. His stomach clenched with hunger, but his heart felt somehow lighter. By the time he climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment, his back was screaming and his empty stomach had begun its familiar growling. He paused outside his door, listening to the soft sounds of Alara moving around inside. She'd be waking up soon, expecting dinner, trusting that Daddy would somehow make everything okay. The apartment felt even smaller when he walked in. 17 feet by 12 feet of everything they owned, from the mattress on the floor that served as Alara's bed to the card table where they ate their meals. The walls were thin enough that he could hear Mrs. Kowalski next door arguing with her television, and the radiator clanked with a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to their poverty. "Daddy!" Alara's voice cut through the gloom as she sat up on the bed, her dark hair sticking up at impossible angles. She held her arms out, and Caleb's heart did that thing it always did when she smiled. Broke a little and healed a little at the same time. "Hey, baby girl," he said, scooping her into his arms despite the protest from his spine. She smelled like sleep and the strawberry shampoo they'd splurged on last week. "Did you have a good nap?" "I dreamed about Mommy again," Alara said, her small hand patting his cheek. She was making pancakes and singing that song she used to sing. Caleb's throat tightened. Sarah had made pancakes every Sunday morning, dancing around their old kitchen while some 70s love song played on her phone. Alara had been barely walking then, but somehow she still remembered. "That sounds like a beautiful dream," he managed. "Are we having dinner now?" Alara asked, and Caleb felt the familiar weight of disappointment settle on his shoulders. He carried her to the tiny kitchenette and opened the refrigerator. Half a carton of milk, expired yesterday but probably still safe. A jar of peanut butter with maybe 2 spoonfuls left. The heel of a loaf of bread that was more crust than anything else. "How about some milk?" he suggested, pouring the last of it into Alara's favorite cup, a plastic one with faded princesses that Sarah had bought at a yard sale. Alara accepted the milk without complaint, settling onto the air mattress that served as their couch. Her trust was absolute, unquestioning. She believed that Daddy would figure it out, that somehow there would always be enough. Caleb's stomach cramped with hunger, but he ignored it. Instead, he sat beside his daughter and pulled her close. "Want to hear a story?" he asked. "The one about the princess and the dragon?" "Sure thing." As Caleb began the familiar tale, Sarah's story, really, the one she'd made up about a brave princess who saved a lonely dragon instead of slaying it, he felt his daughter's breathing slow and deepen against his chest. Outside, the rain continued its relentless drumming against their single window. He didn't notice the black SUV that had been parked at the end of their block for the past hour, its tinted windows hiding the occupants who watched their building with professional patience. He didn't see the small drones hovering just above the roofline, their cameras recording everything through the rain. All Caleb knew was the weight of his daughter in his arms, the hollow ache in his empty stomach, and the strange sense of peace that had settled over him since giving away their last meal to a stranger in an alley. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new impossibilities, new tests of how much one man could sacrifice for the people he loved. But for now, in this moment, he had Alara's warm body against his chest and the sound of her believing in happy endings. It was enough. It had to be enough. In the SUV below, a woman in an expensive suit spoke quietly into her phone. "Yes, ma'am. We've confirmed his identity. Caleb Morrison, age 35, unemployed since the plant closure. One dependent daughter, age 3. No criminal record. No debts beyond normal living expenses." A pause. "Yes, ma'am. The surveillance confirms everything you suspected." He gave away what appeared to be his last meal without hesitation. The phone clicked off, and the woman settled back into her seat. In a few hours, everything would change for the man upstairs. But first, they would wait and watch, gathering the final pieces of evidence that would justify what came next. Above them, Caleb finished the story and carried his sleeping daughter to her bed, never knowing that his act of kindness in a dark alley had set in motion events that would transform both their lives forever. The lights hit at exactly 11:47 p.m. Caleb jolted awake on the air mattress, his damaged spine sending sharp protests through his lower back. For a moment, he thought it might be a fire. The brightness was that intense, that unnatural. White LED floods poured through their single window like artificial daylight, turning their cramped studio into a fishbowl. Car doors slammed in rapid succession. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The sound echoed off the narrow street with military precision. "Daddy?" Alara's voice was small and scared from across the room. She sat up in bed, her stuffed elephant clutched against her chest, eyes wide with the kind of fear that only children feel when their safe world suddenly turns dangerous. Caleb struggled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the window, he could see the silhouettes of vehicles. Big ones, expensive ones, the kind that didn't belong in their neighborhood unless someone was in serious trouble. "It's okay, baby," he whispered, but his voice cracked on the words. "Stay right there, okay? Don't move from the bed." The footsteps on the stairs were measured, deliberate. Not the chaotic scramble of police or the heavy boots of repo men. These were the footsteps of people who owned things, who made decisions that affected other people's lives without breaking a sweat. Caleb positioned himself between the door and Alara's bed, his hands shaking as badly as the old woman's had in the alley. The knock, when it came, was polite but firm. 3 measured raps that somehow conveyed more authority than any shouting would have. "Mr. Morrison?" A woman's voice, educated, professional. "My name is Sloane Richmond. I represent Theodora Lancaster. We'd like a word." Caleb's mouth had gone completely dry. He'd never heard those names before, but the tone carried the weight of serious money. The kind of money that could make problems disappear or create them. "I think you have the wrong apartment," he called back, his voice barely steady. Caleb Morrison, age 35. Daughter Alara Morrison, age 3. Former manufacturing supervisor at Bethlehem Steel, Maryland facility. Currently unemployed. The woman's voice never changed, never wavered. "We have the right apartment, Mr. Morrison." Behind him, Alara whimpered. The sound cut through Caleb's fear like a blade, replacing it with something fiercer. Whatever this was about, whoever these people were, they were scaring his daughter. And that was unacceptable. He unlocked the door but kept the chain engaged, opening it just wide enough to see out. The hallway was full of people in expensive suits. Men and women who looked like they'd stepped out of corporate boardrooms and into his worst nightmare. At the front stood a woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, flanked by 2 men who were clearly security despite their business attire. "What do you want?" Caleb asked. "To talk," said the woman. "Sloane," she'd said, "about what happened in the alley tonight, about the choice you made." Caleb's blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The sandwich, Mr. Morrison. The woman you helped. She'd like to thank you properly." Before Caleb could process what that meant, movement behind the suited figures caught his attention. Someone else was climbing the stairs, moving more slowly than the others. An elderly woman in an elegant black coat that probably cost more than Caleb's rent. Her silver hair now styled and perfect instead of hanging in wet tangles. It was her, the woman from the alley, but transformed, polished, powerful. She looked nothing like the desperate stranger who had thanked him with tears in her eyes just hours ago. "Hello, Caleb," she said, and her voice was different too. Stronger, more refined. "I believe I owe you an explanation." Caleb stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile the broken woman from the alley with this figure of obvious wealth and influence. "I don't understand. May we come in?" she asked. "I'd prefer not to discuss this in the hallway." Every instinct Caleb had screamed that this was wrong, dangerous, impossible. But Alara was still whimpering behind him, and these people clearly weren't going away until they got what they came for. He closed the door long enough to unhook the chain, then opened it wide. They filed into his tiny apartment like a delegation visiting foreign territory. The space that had felt cramped with just him and Alara now seemed impossibly small, with 5 adults in expensive suits examining every detail. Caleb watched their eyes take inventory: the air mattress, the card table, the refrigerator held shut with duct tape, the careful way he'd arranged their few possessions to create the illusion of a home instead of just a place where poverty happened to live. Alara peeked out from behind her stuffed elephant, her dark eyes fixed on the strangers who had invaded their world. Caleb moved to stand directly in front of her bed, creating a barrier between his daughter and whatever this was about to become. "You're scaring her," he said quietly. The elderly woman, Theodora, Sloane had called her, looked past Caleb to where Alara sat clutching her toy. Her expression softened in a way that seemed genuine. "Hello, sweetheart," she said gently. "I'm sorry we woke you up. Your daddy did something very kind for me tonight, and I wanted to say thank you." Alara looked up at Caleb, seeking guidance. He nodded slightly, and she found her voice. "Are you the hungry lady?" she asked. Theodora's composure cracked for just a moment. "Yes," she said. "I was very hungry, and your daddy shared his food with me, even though it meant you wouldn't have any dinner." "Daddy always shares," Alara said matter-of-factly, "even when we don't have very much." The words hit the room like a physical force. Caleb saw something pass between the suited figures, glances that carried meaning he couldn't read. Theodora's eyes never left Alara's face. "My name is Theodora Lancaster," she said finally, turning back to Caleb. "I own Lancaster Healthcare Industries. Perhaps you've heard of it." Caleb shook his head. He'd been too busy trying to survive to pay attention to corporate names. "We operate in 12 states, Theodora continued. "Hospitals, clinics, medical research facilities. Last year, our revenue exceeded $2 billion. She paused, letting the number settle. "But tonight I was robbed. Left with nothing in an alley. Just another desperate woman that most people would cross the street to avoid." "I don't understand why you're here," Caleb said. "Because in that alley you had a choice. You could have walked past me like everyone else did. You could have saved that sandwich for your daughter, who clearly needed it more than some stranger. But you didn't." Theodora's voice carried a weight that made the small apartment feel even smaller. "Do you know how rare that is, Mr. Morrison? True selflessness. It was just a sandwich." "No," she said firmly. "It was everything. It was your last meal, and you gave it away because you couldn't stand to see another human being suffer. Even when that human being was a stranger. Even when it meant your own child would go hungry." One of the men in suits stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, my name is Richard Torres. I'm Mrs. Lancaster's chief financial officer. What she's trying to tell you is that you passed a test you didn't know you were taking." "A test?" Caleb's voice was sharp with rising panic. "What kind of test?" Theodora held up a hand, silencing Richard. "The kind that matters. For the past 6 months, my company has been hemorrhaging talent to competitors. Good people, loyal people, leaving for better offers elsewhere. Do you know why?" Caleb shook his head. "Because they stopped caring about the mission. Healthcare isn't just about profit margins and efficiency metrics. It's about human beings at their most vulnerable moments. But somewhere along the way, my executives forgot that. They started seeing patients as revenue streams instead of people." She moved closer to Caleb, her eyes intense. I need leaders who understand what it means to sacrifice for others, who know what desperation feels like, what hunger looks like, what it's like to choose between your own needs and someone else's pain. I need someone who would give away their last meal to a stranger. You want to offer me a job? The words felt surreal leaving Caleb's mouth. I want to offer you a future, Theodora corrected. For you and for Alara. A position as Director of Community Outreach for our Southwest Division. Based in Dallas, Texas. Starting salary of $120,000, full medical benefits, company housing assistance, and an educational trust fund for your daughter that will cover everything from preschool through graduate school. The numbers hit Caleb like physical blows. More money than he'd ever imagined making. Enough to give Alara the kind of life he'd dreamed about back in Maryland. But it felt impossible, like a cruel joke. Why? He whispered. Because tonight you proved something I'd begun to think didn't exist anymore, Theodora said. That there are still people who choose compassion over self-preservation. Who understand that taking care of each other isn't just good business. It's what makes us human. Alara tugged on Caleb's shirt. Daddy? Are we going to Texas? Caleb looked down at his daughter, then back at the woman who had somehow transformed from a desperate stranger into his potential salvation. What would I actually do? I don't know anything about healthcare. You'd work with communities like this one, Theodora explained. Find the people who fall through the cracks. The single parents who can't afford medical care. The elderly who choose between medication and food. The children who go to bed hungry because their parents are too proud to ask for help. You'd make sure our resources reach them. And you'd have support, added Sloan. A full team of social workers, medical professionals, administrative staff. Your job would be to see what they miss, to understand need the way only someone who's lived it really can. Caleb felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. In his arms, Alara had grown heavy with exhaustion, her trust in him absolute and terrifying. I need time to think, he said. Of course. Theodora reached into her coat and pulled out a business card that felt expensive between Caleb's fingers. But don't take too long. There are other people out there who need what you have to offer. She paused at the door, looking back at him one more time. That sandwich you gave me tonight? It saved my life in more ways than one. Now let me return the favor. The motorcade was gone within minutes, leaving only the faint smell of leather and expensive cologne to prove it had ever existed. Caleb stood at his window, watching the taillights disappear into the rain, Alara sleeping against his shoulder. For the first time in 3 years, hope felt like something more than a luxury he couldn't afford. 2 weeks later, Caleb signed the papers in Theodora's Dallas office, a soaring space of glass and steel that overlooked a city he was still learning to call home. Alara sat in a chair beside his desk, coloring in a book that one of Theodora's assistants had brought her, completely at ease in a world that still felt surreal to her father. Ready? Theodora asked as they stood before the elevator that would take them to the ground floor, where a car was waiting to drive them to the construction site. Caleb nodded, though his stomach still fluttered with nerves. A year into his new job, he'd made recommendations that Theodora had not only accepted but exceeded. The facility they were about to visit was his vision made real. A manufacturing plant that would employ 300 people while providing on-site childcare, medical services, and educational programs. The drive through Dallas still amazed him. 12 months ago, he'd been counting dollars in a cramped apartment, wondering if he could afford both rent and food. Now he lived in a house with a yard where Alara could play, in a neighborhood where children walked to school without fear. But it was the construction site that took his breath away. The Lancaster Community Manufacturing Center rose from the Texas earth like a promise kept. Solar panels covered the rooftops, gardens stretched between buildings, and a playground filled the central courtyard where children would play while their parents worked. The childcare center can accommodate up to 200 children, Theodora explained as they walked through the facilities. Free meals, educational programs, medical checkups. No parent will ever have to choose between working and caring for their child. Caleb watched workers installing equipment that would produce medical devices bound for rural hospitals across the Southwest. Good jobs with benefits that would support families instead of just individuals. A place where a single parent wouldn't have to decide between overtime pay and picking up their child from daycare. You know what the best part is? He said to Theodora as they stood in the executive offices, watching Alara chase butterflies in the garden below. Tell me, every person we hire, every family this place helps. They'll never know that it all started because a desperate man gave away a sandwich in a rainy alley. Caleb smiled, his hand resting on the glass. But we'll know. And maybe that's enough. Theodora joined him at the window, watching his daughter play in the sunshine that seemed to follow her everywhere these days. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the largest changes, Mr. Morrison. You taught me that. Below them, Alara looked up and waved, her smile bright enough to power the entire facility. Caleb waved back, remembering another rainy night when hope had felt like an impossible luxury. Now it was just Tuesday afternoon in Texas, and his daughter was playing in a garden he'd helped design, surrounded by the future they'd built together from nothing more than the willingness to share what little they had. It was enough. It was everything.